All right, so welcome to week 2 of our beginner livestock series, forage and forage quality. Our housekeeping items before we start: make sure that your microphones are muted and your cameras are turned off. Be sure to test your volume now and get something to take notes with so you're ready. And at the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat bar. And if you have questions during the presentation, throw your questions in the chat and we can either stop and answer those questions or save them until the end. And I'll let Michelle and Grace monitor that today because I will be your main presenter. So just a reminder, this is being put on by the Southeast Regional Livestock Team, as we like to call ourselves. It's 3 of us: Michelle in Sullivan County, Grace is in Orange County, and I am in Ulster County. And another reminder, this is an 8-part series. So last week, or 2 weeks ago rather, we covered the introduction to livestock, kind of an intro to the whole series. This week we're covering forage, and in subsequent weeks we'll be covering animal species, meat science and regulations, and livestock auctions. And we're recording each week. So if you miss part of this series, or if you're going to miss part of this series, you can always watch the recording later. Okay, so today we're going to cover what is forage and what are common forages in New York. We're also going to cover what's forage quality and how do we quantify it. And then we'll end on how we can improve forage quality. So let's start with what's forage and what are common forages. So forage is a term that we use to describe crops that animals are grazing independently, pastures, for example, or crops that we grow to be grazed by livestock, or crops that we grow to be conserved as hay or silage. And you might hear the term green chop when we talk about forages. And I just want to mention, this is the feeding of fresh forage that you harvest. So green chop's really only available during the growing season. And when I say hay or silage, what I mean by that is we're preserving the forage either by drying it, so that's hay, or by ensiling it, that's silage. And ensiling forage is when you preserve the forage by excluding all the oxygen from the bale. And that the preservation process really depends on the fermentation that's able to occur under those anaerobic conditions. So silage is created because we have naturally occurring bacteria in the plants. They're converting some of the plant sugars into organic acids, and that's helping preserve the nutritional quality of that forage. And generally, we're making silage or hay so that we have feed when forages aren't growing, such as during the winter. So forages can include perennial grasses. In New York, you might see grasses such as timothy, brome grass, orchard grass, tall fescue, meadow fescue, perennial ryegrass, Virginia wild rye, switchgrass, and big or little blue stem. And I want to point out that grasses can either be cool season or warm season grasses. So on this list, from timothy down to Virginia wild rye, we have cool season grasses. And then switchgrass that you see here on the right and big blue stem are warm season grasses. So what's the difference between a cool season and a warm season grass, and why do we care about it? So it all comes down to how the grass produces energy through photosynthesis. So cool season grasses like timothy use something called C3 photosynthesis, and warm season grasses like switchgrass use C4 photosynthesis. So C3 photosynthesis in simplistic terms produces a 3-carbon compound via the Calvin cycle. If you remember high school biology and photosynthesis and the Calvin cycle, great. If not, don't worry about it. And C4 photosynthesis produces an intermediate 4-carbon compound that gets split into a 3-carbon compound for the Calvin cycle to then grow that biomass in that plant. And why this matters in a forage system is cool season grasses are going to yield biomass for your farm or your homestead in the spring and fall, and warm season grasses, whether they're annuals or perennials, are going to see that peak biomass in the summer. And so we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but when we're thinking about forage crops, diversity is really key. And if we want to think about ways to extend the growing season and the grazing season on our farms or homestead, having a mixture of cool season and warm season plants is one way we can help do that. Okay, so there's perennial grasses that can be forage crops. There are also annual forage crops. In New York, these include oats, triticale, winter wheat, barley, rye, and sometimes millet. All of these except millets are cool season crops, and millets are warm season crops. And these annual forage crops can really be used to help you get more mid to late summer forage production. Oats and spring triticale, when you plant them early in the spring and then you graze them early, you might even be able to get an additional harvest. And we can talk more about that later. There's also perennial forage crops like perennial legumes. So these include alfalfa, clovers like white clover or red clover, and bird's foot trefoil. And then there's also rapeseed, radish, turnip, and kale. These are your forage brassica crops. And these are annuals that you can utilize in your pasture during the spring, summer, and fall grazing seasons. So you can use these across the year. They're really quick maturing, and they can generally be grazed about 2 to 3 months after planting, depending on the species. So this is a good school to think about whenever you're considering what forage crops you want to plant or utilize. So those were all herbaceous forages. Now we're going to talk about non-herbaceous forages. So forages can also come from shrubs, trees, woody vines, and other vegetation that's not herbaceous. So not your grasses, not your legumes, not your brassicas. And often we refer to these forages as browse or mast. So browse is like the leaves, twigs, and seed pods sometimes of trees. So here you see some humans eating locust seed pods. And then mast is the fruit and seeds that we see from these woody plants that are not herbaceous. So like raspberries. And yes, livestock can eat berries. So how are you going to select what forages you want to use for your livestock species? And I think this is a good question and one that we often hear from beginner producers. So one thing Cornell has developed is this forage tool that helps you select forage species for your livestock and for your land area. And you can access it at forages.org. So this is a snip of the tool, so you know what it looks like. And before you even use this tool, one thing to note is that it asks for your soil type. The tool can estimate your soil type based on where you are in New York State. But we talked about this a little last week. A great place to start to find out what soil you likely have on your land is the Web Soil Survey. So you can access this through the United States Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource and Conservation Service website, and we can send the link after this. And just another note before you dive into this forage tool is wetlands are a really important consideration before you even think about where you're going to pasture your animals or grow forages for your animals. We talked about regulations last week, including New York State regulations related to water and wetlands. So before you even think about it, check out the Department of Environmental Conservation's website. They have an environmental resource mapper, and you can find out if there are indeed wetlands on your property. And if so, you can reach out to the Department of Environmental Conservation or your local soil and water district office, or even us at Cornell Cooperative Extension, so we can help you navigate that. Okay, so whenever you put your zip code, soil type, county, and what species of livestock you're interested in raising into that forage calculator, you end up with a page that looks like this, the results page. And what this tells you is recommended species in New York State, in your area, for the livestock that you're planning to raise. And it gives you the list of species names, how many tons per acre you'll likely expect to grow on your property based on where you are in New York, and how much material you're likely going to get over the course of the year. So pounds of dry matter per acre per month. And this is really helpful as you plan for stockpiling storage forages in the winter. So you can see in this result that we have for, this is Walk Hill in Ulster County. There's no forage being estimated that will be grown in November and December and January, etc. So we have to look at this to see how much we can produce every month, and we can kind of plan for whether we're going to need to stockpile some of that forage for the winter or not. Okay, the tool also gives you a list of species that are acceptable to use as forages for your livestock species, but or that are acceptable, I'm sorry, for your land area, but they're not recommended for your particular livestock. And so this is just a good list to think about, especially if you're considering multi-species on your property. And you can go through the tool for each of the livestock that you're considering. Okay, you've gone through the tool. It's given you a list of forages that you might want to consider planting on your property, using on your property if you're going to plant forages. And part of what the tool does is it takes into consideration where you're located in the state. So I just wanted to remind everyone to last week, when we gave our introductory presentation, Michelle mentioned the United States Department of Agriculture plant hardiness zones. So this is a map that shows plant hardiness zones in New York State. I'm zoomed in here on my county, Ulster County, but you can see there's a range of these zones. And so when you're considering growing certain forage crops on your property, you really need to make sure that that crop can thrive in that plant environment. So as you can see where I am in Ulster County, those plants hardiness zones range anywhere from 6 to 4. And so the temperature range that they can handle, those minimum temperatures and frost-free dates, are really wide in range. And so, you know, we really have to consider what's our own individual climate on our property. Okay, and I'm just going to plug here the Climate Smart Farming website that Cornell has. Again, we talked about this a little bit last week, but when you're trying to figure out, you know, what are those minimum temperatures that my plants can handle? What are my frost-free days? How many growing degree days do I have in a year? What's precipitation likely going to look like for my area? This is a great place to start. There's a lot of decision tools here that can help you figure out those answers. Okay, and so for these forages, you know, we really have to think about soil fertility and pH, because forages need nutrients to grow. So again, forages are these crops that we're either letting our livestock graze on, or we're growing and harvesting and either haying or ensiling for our livestock. But before we even get to that point, a soil test is key. So I think I can speak for the three of us. We always say, soil test before you do anything else. Michelle touched on this last week, but soil pH really affects the availability of different plant nutrients, including the top 3, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And forages need these nutrients to grow. So before you even consider planning what forages you're going to be using, you need to make sure that your soil is going to be able to provide the nutrients that those forages need. So always start with a soil test. Okay, so what's forage quality and how do we quantify it? I think that's why a lot of us are here today. Well, forage quality is all of the plant constituents that influence an animal's use of that plant. So it's not just nutritive value, but that does play a large role. It's also plant morphology. So how many leaves of that plant do you have compared to the stem? What's that leaf to stem ratio? What's the forage intake? How palatable is that forage? And really, forage quality is always relative to the nutritional needs of the livestock eating the forage. Some people talk about forage quality in terms of visual forage quality. You can get some indication just by looking at a forage, the color, the leaves to stem ratio. If you have more leafy material, you likely have more nutritional value, but really we need more than just that visual indication. And again, I just want to drive home the point that forage quality is really relative to the nutritional needs of the livestock that you're raising. So you want to be sure to check those, and we have a lot of great resources for each individual livestock. This is just one example table that shows nutrient needs for cows in early lactation and what the pastures might supply. And this is important because if you have a doe that is pregnant and getting ready to have kids, the forage needs of that livestock animal are a lot different than a dairy cow that you might be raising on your property. Okay, so why does it really matter? Well, we want the nutrient composition of what we're feeding our livestock to meet their daily nutritional needs. And this is really important from an animal health and production perspective, because if we're not meeting their nutritional needs, they could have health issues. If we are meeting their nutritional needs, that's great because we're probably going to get the production that we want. And that can also come down to economics. So if we have high quality forages and we're meeting the nutritional needs of our livestock with those high quality forages, that can really reduce overall costs, especially as feed costs rise across the country. Now, the quality of that forage is affected by the plant species and the variety or cultivar. It's going to be affected by the weather. So temperature can have a huge impact on forage quality. It can increase the amount of lignin, which we'll talk about a little later. And that can create a less desirable forage for your livestock. I said the leaf to stem ratio already, that can affect your forage quality. Your soil fertility, we're driving home this point in the series about the importance of testing your soil and making sure you have the nutrients you need to grow the plants that you want, but this is really true with forage quality. A big part of what we look at in our animals is crude protein, and that protein is coming from nitrogen. That's coming from the soil, from things that you're applying to the soil, from organic matter that's being left there. So really need good quality soil, or you need to improve the fertility of your soil to make sure you're getting good forage quality. How you harvest and store forages, if you're harvesting them and not just grazing them, is really important and can affect forage quality. If you're harvesting hay wet, you're going to get mold. If you're storing silage in bags that aren't completely anaerobic, you're not going to get that fermentation and that preservation of the nutritive value that we want. The quality of a forage is also going to be affected by weeds. So if you have plants that you don't want in your mix, in your pasture, in your hay field, those are going to reduce the yield of the good forages that you want. Pests, we can't always control this, but there are insects that can affect our forages and cause disease. And then finally, really, I think the most important factor that we can control in some respect is maturity stage at harvest. So the maturity stage of your plant is really important. If you're harvesting this plant when it's really young, you'll likely have a better quality forage than when you're harvesting it when it's too old. And we're going to get into that now. Okay. So why does plant maturity matter so much? Well, plants are made up of cells, and the cell content contains the sugars, starch, and protein. So young plants, they'll have cells that will contain, the sugars, starches, proteins, vitamins, and they're going to have shallower cell walls. They're going to be mostly these cells, right? Then as the plant grows, the cell wall is going to increase and get bigger. And this is where we find these moderately digestible components of the cell, like hemicellulose and cellulose. And then as the plant matures further, that proportion of the cell wall continues to increase. So as the plant matures, we end up seeing more lignin that's in the cell wall. This is not digestible. And so as the plant matures and it moves from growing cells to increasing the proportion of that cell wall size, we see the digestibility of the forage decrease. But you might be asking yourself, well, okay, she says as the plant grows, the digestibility is going to decrease, but what about the yield? As I'm growing a forage in my pasture, as I'm growing my alfalfa for hay, I'm increasing yield over time. So isn't that great? Well, yes, so yield increases over time as the plant grows from its vegetative stage into when it's forming seeds. And that's great, but the quality of that forage is also going to decrease as the plant grows. And that's just because of how the plant is using the nutrients in the soil to live and grow. And so you really need to balance your forage quality with your yield and figure out the sweet spot of when is the best time to graze based on the forage species that you're using. Okay, so one of the biggest things that we can quantify to understand this moderately digestible and indigestible fiber fraction of the forage, we can quantify two things, cellulose and lignin, through what's called an acid detergent fiber test. And we can quantify cellulose, lignin, and hemicellulose through what's called the indicator that's called neutral detergent fiber. And so there's kind of two ways we can quantify acid detergent fiber, ADF, and neutral detergent fiber, or NDF. The first method is through what's called traditional wet chemistry. And this has been around for decades. You can learn more. We can send you the Van Soest paper from the early 90s. But essentially, these use wet chemistry methods to determine the nutritive value of that forage. And wet chemistry really just separates the feeds into those distinct fractions of cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, pectin, etc. Today, though, we also have what's called near-infrared reflectance spectroscopy, or NIR. And this is typically what I would recommend that you are doing whenever you want to sample forages to quantify the nutritive value to help you understand that forage quality. So NIR works a little bit different than traditional wet chemistry in that a forage lab has already analyzed a large number of samples by traditional wet chemistry. And now they've also analyzed samples by near infrared. So they've looked at those samples that they've analyzed by wet chemistry, and then they've also looked at those samples to understand how much light the sample is absorbing at near infrared wavelengths. Based on the amount of nutrients they measure in traditional wet chemistry, they come up with a relationship, and then they program a computer to recognize that relationship for different nutritive value indicators like acid detergent fiber and neutral detergent fiber. And I guess the difference between these two also comes down to how long it takes and the cost. So traditional wet chemistry, if you're sending your sample into a lab, the minimum return time of your sample results is going to be about 10 days because there's a long fermentation time that's needed to analyze the nutritive value of that sample. For NIR, typically you'll get results within a day of the lab that you sent it to receiving your sample. So it's a lot faster of a process. And generally, we recommend sending your forage samples to Dairy 1 This forage lab is in New York State. Granted, there are certainly others, but this is the closest, and they do a great job. So we typically recommend sending it here. We can send you the link, but the web address is dairy1.com, and you'll want to send it to the forage laboratory. And so when you're sending a forage sample to the lab, what indicators are you going to be interested in learning about? Well, aside from acid detergent fiber and neutral detergent fiber, which are big ones, there are other indicators of nutritive value that you'll want to look at. So these are not directly measured. They're usually estimated from acid detergent fiber and neutral detergent fiber or nitrogen. But these are things that you're going to be interested in, and we'll talk more about that. But nitrogen is going to be an important indicator of forage quality, how much nitrogen is in that forage. Crude protein is going to be an important forage quality indicator. And this is actually estimated from nitrogen. So we typically assume the nitrogen content of proteins is about 16%. So labs will generally measure the nitrogen content, usually by combustion, and then they'll multiply the nitrogen content by 6.25, because if it's 16%, then there's 1 part N for every 6.25 parts protein. Other estimates of forage quality, like total digestible nutrients, or TDN, net energy for lactation, or NEL, and relative feed value, or RFV, are also derived from mathematical manipulations of the neutral detergent fiber and acid detergent fiber values. But again, these are really important indicators of forage quality. So if you have forage on your property, maybe you already have a pasture and you're trying to understand if the quality of that pasture is good for your livestock or not, or you're growing alfalfa or another forage for hay or silage, and you want to know if that forage has a high or good forage quality. You're going to want to take a sample to send it to Dairy One or another lab. So how do you do that? Well, it's pretty simple. There's a few quick rules of thumb. You always want to send a quart-sized sample so that the lab has enough material to analyze the forage quality. And you generally just want to send this in a plastic Ziploc bag. Taking a sample is really the first step in this nutritive analysis, and it seems simple, but it's arguably the most important. So you want to make sure that you collect what's called a composite sample and get that composite sample into the Ziploc bag that you send. So a composite sample is when you collect several subsamples and then you mix them together. You can collect samples from your forages and put them in a big plastic bucket and then mix it thoroughly, and then you can submit that composite sample. So let's go through a few examples. So if you have a pasture and you want to send a sample for analysis, what you're going to want to do is walk in a zigzag pattern across the pasture and stop 12 to 20 times. This is a good rule of thumb. Then you're going to want to clip a handful of that forage at the grazing height. Take that handful and put it in, say, a plastic bucket that you're carrying with you. Move on to the next site, repeat at 20 sites, and then you'll thoroughly mix that sample in the bucket. You'll want to take about a pound. That's probably what will end up fitting when you stuff it into the Ziploc bag. And for pasture, it's a good idea to freeze the sample for about 12 hours before you submit it for analysis. And this is important because it's going to prevent any chemical changes from happening due to respiration or fermentation of that material. If you have hay, if you have different types of hay, you should sample your cuttings or your lots separately. You can use a forage sampler. Penn State has a forage sampler, other universities do, or you can use a hay probe. But essentially, you're just going to bore, again, 12 to 20 bales. So instead of pasture samples, we're talking about the hay bales now. at random using that hay probe. So to do that, if it's a square bale, you would put the probe through the center of the small square end of the bale and collect a sample, combine all of those sub-samples, those sub-core samples together in a bucket, mix them, and then submit that. If you're using a round bale, you'll always want to sample the curved side with the core perpendicular to the side. And again, combine all the core samples. Okay, and then if you have silage, same thing, 12 to 20 samples is really important. I like to collect about half of those across the silage base, remove some of the silage, do it again. So you get 2 sets of fresh samples, and again, mix them together and submit the composite sample. One important part of if you're sampling silage or anything, wrapped in plastic, you're going to want to make sure that you tape those holes shut after sampling, so that you're not interrupting that anaerobic process and that fermentation that you want to happen to preserve that material. And again, Dairy One has some great resources, and we can send these out to everyone after this presentation on how to collect a forage sample for all different types of forages. So we're not going to go through that list today, it's exhaustive, but it's there and we'll send it to you so you can check it out for your needs. So then you're going to send your sample off to the lab to try and understand its nutritive value. Then they're going to send you back a sheet that looks like this if you send it to Dairy One. So you'll either, and this is in Ithaca, so not too far from where we are. So you can either receive these results printed, or you can receive them via email as an electronic copy. And the forage analysis is going to have all of those indicators that we talked about before, like crude protein, acid detergent fiber, neutral detergent fiber, and other things like starch, water-soluble carbohydrates, crude fat, ash, net energy for maintenance, that's NEM, net energy for gain, or NEG. And so to understand whether your forage is good quality, low quality, or just right, a good first step is definitely reaching out to your local extension office. We can help you with this, but also checking out this feed composition library. And I forgot to put the link to this on the PowerPoint, so we'll send that out too. But this is a great place to start. There's a library of all forages that we have across New York State. There's a main library that covers lots of parts of the United States. And then there's a state seasonal feed composition library that you can explore just for New York State for your forage of interest. In this case, I've selected fresh forages for legume pastures, and I've selected all the years of record, so from 2004 to 2022. And then on the right, the feed composition library gives me these results. It shows how many samples the lab received and kind of what was the average range of those samples. So on average, they had about 20% dry matter for that legume pasture. The crude protein is pretty high, 26% crude protein. We would expect that in a legume, but this helps you to get an understanding of where your results fall into the typical results across the state. And so if you're sending in a legume pasture mix and it's coming back saying your crude protein is only 15%, it's pretty low and actually outside of this range. So then we have to think about, well, what's going on here? Was it really a legume pasture? What else is in there? Was it contaminated with weeds, etc.? And then when you get these results back too, you always want to make sure that the nutritive value of that forage is matching what your animals need. So we have a lot of tools we can send you for different animals, and I think Michelle and Grace will get more into this when we get into specific species. But you want to make sure that you're meeting those livestock's needs. So I've just put for an example here the Maryland small ruminant page. This is something we often refer producers to, and this is for specifically sheep and goats and really making sure that what you're feeding them is balanced. Okay. In general, These are some good rules of thumb. This is another way you can start to analyze your results when you get them back from the lab. So if you sent in hay, you really want to be harvesting hay when it's below 15% moisture content. So that's about 85% dry matter, so pretty dry. Alfalfa, when you're sending that in, a good rule of thumb is that neutral detergent fiber is below 40%. Again, that's the fiber portion. So that's going to decrease animal intake. And so lower is better. Also for alfalfa, we want that acid detergent fiber to be less than 35%. And crude protein, alfalfa is a legume, you'd expect it to be higher, so greater than 15%. That's just a good ballpark general goal to kind of aim for and to look at your forage against that ballpark when you get the results back. For perennial grasses, the neutral detergent fiber will probably be a little higher. 55% or less is a good ballpark estimate for a good forage. Acid detergent fiber, you're going to want that to be less than 35%. And then crude protein will generally be more than 9%. But again, you can see grasses are not legumes, so they're not fixing all that nitrogen, and therefore that crude protein is generally a little bit lower. Okay, so we talked about in general, what's forage, some common forages we see in our state, what's forage quality, and how do we quantify it. But I think what a lot of us want to know is how can we improve forage quality? So we talked about forage maturity at the time of grazing and how the digestibility of a forage is going to decrease as that plant matures because we're increasing the fiber content while the yield is going to increase. So there's going to be this sweet spot. And so this is like one of the most important factors that we can control when we harvest a forage. So keeping track of when that was planted, if you're planting the forage, say you're planting winter rye, so that you can integrate a cover crop into or a double crop into your operation, really keeping track of when that gets planted and then monitoring that plant to see how it's developing and making sure that you harvest it at the right time. Okay, we can also improve forage quality by selecting plant species that tend to have higher nutritive value. We can include more plant variety. So this goes along with plant species. If you just have cool season grasses in your forage mix and you notice that the crude protein is really low, you can incorporate legumes into that plant mix so that you can increase that crude protein content because legumes fix nitrogen. You could look at your soil fertility. So if you think you're doing everything right, you used the tool that Cornell has to pick the species, you picked a plant variety that's a really great diverse mixture, it has legumes, so you're getting the protein that you need, you followed all the instructions to plant it, but for some reason you're really not getting good forage quality, you really want to check the soil fertility then, especially when you're starting out. Take a soil sample at the beginning, and then you want to sample, every 3 years once you really get things going, and maybe annually before that. Because again, if that soil fertility is off, especially pH, your plants may not be getting the nutrients that they need from the soil. And so your forage quality is going to be lower because your plants need those nutrients to grow. You really want to monitor the forage that you have. And we're going to talk about like using a grazing stick like I have here in a little bit. But you want to be out in your fields monitoring the forage, checking for weed pressure, checking to see how things are growing, making sure you're managing weeds using an integrated weed management approach. We can talk more about that at the end or offline. You can also improve forage quality by seeding. So right now, fertilizer is really expensive. You might want to consider, if you're looking at renovating a pasture next year in the spring, in March, late winter, early spring, frost seeding legumes into your pasture. There's kind of two schools of thought. Do we need to seed? Do we not need to seed? And I think it really comes down to your specific site and what you currently have at that location. So you really need to do a good assessment of what you have before you think about seeding, but certainly overseeding or frost seeding a pasture can really help improve the forage quality if you have all of these other things in check, the weeds, the soil fertility, etc. Grazing management is another way we can improve forage quality. We're going to talk more about that. And then making sure you're keeping an eye out for pests. So going back to monitoring the forage, you want to be scouting for pests and diseases in your fields. And then finally, another way to improve forage quality that we really can't control necessarily is the weather. But we're going to talk more about that. So we're going to go through this list one by one. So harvest date. This is a figure that shows forage dry matter and quality over time as the plant is developing from growing its leaves at its leafy stage to the boot stage, then when it's heading out, and then you see it in bloom. That's the farthest right on the x-axis. And the y-axis shows the dry weight of organic materials in that plant. So this top line, that's solid, is the yield of the plant. You can see it's increasing over time. The fiber component, this is that acid detergent fiber and neutral detergent fiber forage quality indicator that we talked about. You can see those increasing over time. So as the plant cell is developing, a larger proportion of that cell wall where the cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin live, those moderately digestible and then indigestible components of the plant, those are increasing over time. We see protein kind of increasing over time, peaking, and then slowly declining. And then again, lignin follows a similar path as the fiber. So it's increasing over time as that plant is maturing, as that cell wall is maturing. So it's good to keep in mind that digestibility again is decreasing over time while the yield is increasing. So you need to find the sweet spot depending on the forage species that you have whenever you're looking at harvesting forage, especially. Okay, so next on our list that we just looked at was plant species and variety. So this is really important. Diversity, diversity, diversity. I say this a lot. The more diverse of a mixture you have, probably the better that you're going to be able to adapt and be resilient to external pressures. You want to start by looking at what you have and weigh whether you need to add in more variety. Again, always start with a soil test and make sure that you have the right environmental conditions, so whatever your seed isn't going to waste. And you want to choose plants that are really appropriate for your soil type, your hydrologic conditions, and your livestock. So these are all, again, things you want to keep in mind. If you have poorly drained soil, you're not going to want to plant alfalfa on it. It's just going to end up being a waste of money, most likely. You also want to choose plants that play well together and complement each other. So going back to earlier in the presentation, we looked at the difference between warm season and cool season perennial grasses and how they could complement each other if they were both planted on the same land area or the same farm. But you want to make sure that those grasses are playing well together. Some grasses, like switchgrass, for example, can be really aggressive. And so if you've seeded too much of that into your mixture, it might not play as well with the Virginia wild rye that you have also planted. So you want to make sure that plants that you're seeding together get along and complement each other so that you'll find higher yields for different plants across the year so that you can really extend that grazing season if you're grazing. Always consider adding legumes. We talked about frost seeding briefly. So that's when you, again, seed late winter, early spring, whenever that freeze thaw cycle is happening. So you can seed over your pastures and that freeze thaw cycle will work that seed into the ground. And this is important because right now, especially, fertilizer is expensive and your plants need protein and your animals need protein. So really, to increase forage quality, considering adding legumes is a great idea. Again, diversity, diversity, diversity. And I can't emphasize enough, before you reseed, just check your other management practices. Make sure you've done the soil test, think about how you're grazing, think about your hydrologic conditions before you're spending money. Okay, also on our list of how we can improve forage quality. So weed management, you want to know what you have. So what are the good plants that you have? If you have a pasture, what do you have in the pasture already? What do you want and what do you have? You also want to know your enemy. What do you have that you don't want? And what are ways that you're going to mitigate that? A weed is really just something that is there that you don't want it there, a plant that you don't want in your pasture. That's a weed. So you want to know what your weeds are and how you're going to control them. And, a good stand of plants that you want is going to be more competitive than if you have a poor stand of forages already. If you have a lot of bare spots on your fields, they're going to offer places for weeds to come in and outcompete the good forages that you want there. So some good resources are your county extension office, obviously, but you want to reach out and find books, find materials. We can share these with you on how to identify the grasses that you have, how to identify the weeds that you have. Grasses can be tricky. I have a snip here of parts of a grass plant on the right-hand side. And often one of the biggest indicators that we use when grasses are young this time of the year in the field is we'll look at the grass sheath and the leaf blade, which you can see here on the diagram. And there's this little part here, the armpit of the grass plant, that's the ligule. And it's a really important way to identify grasses. Some grasses are hairy in the ligules, some are not, some have long hairs. And so here's a description of big blue stem. This is a warm season grass. It's native to the greater United States. Not everywhere in New York can make big blue stem work because of that plant hardiness zone being a little cooler. But you can see here it's talking about it being 4 to 7 feet tall. So when this plant is fully mature in the fall, you can identify it. It has a turkey foot top, and you'll know it by its color and its height and that turkey foot at the top of the plant. But when it's younger, you might look at these fine hairs where the leaf joins the stem at that ligule. It's a really good idea to find resources and start reviewing them now before you're even starting. So you're ready. When you're ready, you can go out on the land that you purchase or that you're leasing, and you can start to identify the plants that you have, the ones that you want. And again, you can always reach out to your county extension office and we can come out for a site visit and help you do this. Also, you want to know what weeds you have. So 2 really good resources you can check out are the Cornell Weed ID website. So I have the URL posted here on the left-hand side of the screen. And then I'm a big fan of using this Weeds of the Northeast book. I carry this with me anywhere I go, and it has great photographs. So you can learn to identify weeds at all stages of development. We're at the tail end of spring. So I just wanted to point out some of the weeds that you might see rosettes forming in New York right now. So horseweed or mare's tail, annual fleabane, Canada goldenrod, evening primrose, shepherd's purse, pepperweed, pennycress, and common mullein. So if you're interested in trying to go out and find these in your fields or elsewhere in your community, let us know and we can help send some more resources your way. We just have a few slides here to show some of the common ones that you might see. This is mare's tail or horseweed. And again, you can see at different stages of development when it's forming, it might be harder to see when it's just emerging from the ground versus when the plant has fully matured and has a seed head and is flowered and is more easily identifiable. This is poison hemlock. This often gets mistaken for other plants like Queen Anne's lace, but it's distinguishable by its red stem. It has dots on the stem. You might see this in your pastures if you have old pastures that you're renovating, and we want to get it out of there. It's a poisonous plant. It can cause a really bad skin reaction on you, and you don't want your livestock to necessarily be eating it either. Okay, this is Canada thistle. This is another really common one that you might see in your pastures if you're renovating old pastures. And again, you might identify it by its spiky rosette, or then when it's older, and you can see it has these flowers, the Canada thistle flowers. So whenever you're going out in the fields, you want to know, what time of year is it? What's the weed going to look like at this time of year? Is it a perennial weed? Is it an annual weed? Is it a biennial? So are you going to see that rosette? And then you're not going to see the weed flower until the next year. So you want to make sure that you're educated before you're going out in the pasture. And monitoring pastures is certainly about weed management and monitoring for weeds, but it's also about, once you have a pasture going, monitoring how much material that you have on your pasture that's available for your livestock to eat. So this is a grazing stick. I hope you can see it. This is actually a warm season grass grazing stick. And it's not really a precision instrument, but they say it's more generally correct than precisely wrong. And just like sampling your pasture for a forage sample that you might send to a lab, you want to sample your pasture a similar way with this. So you would walk through the pasture, follow kind of a zigzag route so that you're getting measurements across the pasture. And you really want to take at least 10 measurements per acre. More is really better. And so how it works is one side of it has a numbering system, and this is in inches. So you can measure your pasture to understand how many inches of material that you have. And really, for best results, you want to evaluate your pasture when it is between 6 and 12 inches tall. But if you don't have that much, we can talk about that. So you'd go around the paddock, take those 10 measurements and measure the height of your grasses. And then you're going to subtract 3 inches from that, because you want to leave at least 3 inches on the ground. You don't want your livestock to be grazing the pasture all the way down to nothing, to the bare soil, right? We want to keep that grass there so it's growing, keeps growing, and it's getting better over time. And then what you do is you turn it to the density side of this grazing stick, which on mine is up here, and there are dots along a grid, and you would lay this down in your pasture and look at how many dots you can see. And then you turn the stick, and that density chart has a chart that says the number of dots that you counted by forage type have an estimated pounds of dry matter per acre per inch. So if I laid this in the field and I saw 3 dots, I know that for this warm season grass stick, I have 3 or more pounds of dry matter per acre per inch. So you can multiply the average inches minus 3 inches that you calculated initially by that pounds per acre per inch of dry matter to see how much material is available for your livestock to eat. And then you can start to think about, well, how many days can my livestock eat that material before I need to move them, or before I need to supplement that with other forages or other feed. And so part of figuring out how much material is available and what you're going to do with your livestock is considering managing your grazing system. And there are a lot of terms around grazing management. There's continuous grazing, there's rotational grazing, there's ultra high stock density and mob grazing. There's other terms like regenerative, where there's not really a legal definition, but it's out there in the public space. So we're just going to cover some basics, but continuous grazing is when you're leaving your animals in one space and letting them graze. You're not managing where they're grazing in that space. And so that has its limitations because you need enough land area to support those livestock without having to rotate them. And really, we don't generally recommend continuous grazing. We want to be rotating our livestock. And there's a lot of different definitions of rotational grazing, but really what you need to know is it generally means you're going to divide your pastures into subpastures or paddocks. And, you might down the road talk about getting into like really ultra high intensity rotational grazing, but we're not going to start there. We're going to start with just rotational grazing. So the basic idea is it's going to allow your pasture plants enough time to rest and regrow before your livestock graze it again. So in a continuous grazing system, you don't have this luxury because your livestock are always in that area. And so you're not planning for those plants that time that they really need to rest and regrow before they're grazed again. And there are some benefits. You might get a higher yield over the course of a year. Maybe you can extend the growing season. You might find that your pastures are more drought tolerant or flood tolerant because you have good cover. You might find that you might get better or more consistent nutrition, higher forage quality or more consistent forage quality for your animals. And the trade-offs, rotational grazing can take more people, more labor. It takes time and effort to set up many paddocks. There can be a higher cost. You need more fencing. You might need more water infrastructure. So you really have to weigh what you're capable of doing before you jump into this. And a really good resource is from the United States Department of Agriculture. This is a guide. It's available online and we can send it to you, called Pastures for Profit, a guide to rotational grazing. And in it, you can follow some good examples. We'll go through some of those right now. If you have livestock already and you're trying to figure out how much land you need, you'll want to go through calculations that help you put together a rotational grazing plan that's limited by the number of animals. And if you're limited by the amount of land, say you purchase or lease 10 acres and you're trying to figure out how many animals you can put in that pasture, what's the rate at which you can stock it based on the number of animals, the size of those animals, that's your stocking rate. Those are kind of your two options for calculating how you're going to create that rotational grazing plan. So here's kind of an example that I pulled from that guide that I showed you. And this is to help you determine those stocking rates and acres needed. So how many animals should you put in a pasture? So you're going to first determine how much pasture you have available. So in this example, they have 20 acres. Then you're going to estimate the pasture yield per acre. So there's tables in here, or you can use your own if you know how high of a yield you have per acre. You've been monitoring it with your grazing stick, for example, and keeping track of that. And then you're going to estimate, all right, what's the length of my grazing season? So you're going to go to the Cornell Climate Smart Communities, or not Climate Smart Communities, the Climate Smart Farming website, and you're going to figure out, well, how many growing degrees days do I have? What's my grazing season going to be? What's the possibility? Then you're going to figure out what's the weight of one of my animals. So you need to know how much an animal's going to weigh. Are you grazing goats? They're going to be a lot smaller than if you're grazing beef cattle. So the amount of animals that you're going to be able to put on that pasture is going to differ by species and by the age of those animals. So if you have a lot of lambs grazing versus if you have mature sheep, they have very different weights. And then you're going to estimate the number of animals that can be grazed on the pasture using that information. So the acreage of the pasture times the average yield per acre. And then you'll divide that by the average weight per animal multiplied by the total days that are being grazed. And then, here's an example. So if you have 20 acres and you're getting about 4,000 pounds of forage per acre, based on your pasture estimates, you can hold about 65 ewes with lambs. Okay, and then, if you have a lot of pasture, or you already have, you don't have land yet, but you have a fixed number of livestock, then you might want to use a less intensive system. And this is a calculation that you can go through to understand what's the minimum amount of land that you need to pasture your herd. So you're going to take, again, the number of animals, if that's fixed, that you have, multiplied by the average weight per animal of those animals to come up with the total amount of weight that pasture is going to need to support, and multiply that by the total days that you're going to be grazing. How many days are you able to graze on that pasture? Divide that by the amount of material that pasture is producing, and then you can come up with an acreage that you need. Okay, so once you know how much land you need, or how many animals your land can support, and you can also refer to the guides that Michelle, Grace, and I sent out 2 weeks ago. But once you know that, then you can look at, all right, well, how am I going to divide that land to ensure that I have the amount of rest that I want for those grasses? And so, the number of paddocks, when you're thinking about planning a rotational grazing system, really can be flexible. It doesn't need to be rigid. So you're probably going to use portable fencing so you can adjust and be flexible and make changes. You've got to call audibles as you go and as you're monitoring for how your pastures are doing. But essentially, if you take the rest period that you want and you divide by the grazing period plus the number of animals, this is going to give you the number of paddocks. So say you come up with, you want a 30-day rest period, and you want your animals to graze it for 3 days, and you have just one animal group. Maybe you have 5 sheep. Then you know that you want to divide that land into 11 paddocks. So 30-day rest period divided by a 3-day grazing period plus one animal group. You want to divide your land into 11 paddocks. So this is just one example. And if you want to talk more specifically about examples for your farm, we are here as a resource. I also just wanted to mention strip grazing. So this is another type of rotational grazing setup that you might have heard of, or you might be thinking about. And this is where you use wires that are perpendicular to your permanent fence. You might have a permanent fence that you build outside of your pasture, or that you already have outside of the pasture that you're either buying or leasing. And then you have wires that you then move along that permanent fence according to your plan and how your pastures are doing and really what your animals need. So again, you want to keep monitoring in all of these systems, because sometimes you're going to have to adjust the plan. So you might make a calendar, write out your plan in pencil, and then go back and throughout the year, keep track of what actually happened over the year, because you're going to have to make changes. Okay, so before you even start with rotational grazing, I just wanted to drive home a few points. You're going to have to consider how much shade you have on your property. Do you have water availability? What forages are already available? Do you have fencing? What's the topography of your land? Do you have really steep areas that you're not going to want to use? And then again, as you go, you're going to have to monitor, how's the production of your forage going? Are you producing enough? Do you have bare spots? Are you overgrazing? Are your livestock kind of just camping somewhere, maybe under one tree, and suggesting that they might need more shade? Is the recovery time enough, or do you need to make changes? Okay, going back to that initial list, how can we improve forage quality? Another thing you can do to improve forage quality is really monitor for pests and diseases on your property. So based on what type of forage you're growing, again, like with weeds, you want to know what's the pest or disease of concern, and you want to go out in your fields and scout regularly. So these are just two examples impacting alfalfa, the potato leafhopper, and root rot. But there's a lot of other examples of pests and diseases out there. And one thing you can do other than scouting, monitoring, and knowing what to look for is diversity. So plant diversity is one of the biggest things that we can do to prevent against one pest or one disease destroying our whole crop. So diversity is always good to think about. And then weather, again, diversity, diversity, diversity. You know, we can't control the weather. We can't control whether we're going to get a lot of rain one year or not enough rain the next year, but you can control, you know, when you harvest, if you're harvesting forage, and you can also control what's in your field. So you can have a diversity of plants, maybe some that are drought tolerant, some that like wet feet and are a little bit more flood tolerant. Having that diversity helps you build that capability of being resilient to the weather that you can't control. Okay, and then before we end today, I just want to mention, you know, we're talking a lot about grazing and pastures and hay fields. And if you don't know about this program, the United States Department of Agriculture's Farm Service Agency has a conservation reserve program, sometimes called CREP. And a new part of that program is the grasslands program. And under this program, rather than taking land out of production and then not being able to hay it or graze it, now under this program, farmers can continue to graze those lands or hay those lands in exchange for receiving a rental rate. And that rate depends on where you are in the nation, but the minimum is $13 an acre. So if you want more information about that, we can share that, or you can also reach out to your local county soil and water conservation district. Okay, so today we covered in brief what's forage, what are common forages, what's forage quality and how do we quantify it, and how can we improve that forage quality. It was a lot of a little, again, like we covered 2 weeks ago, so we can dive deeper if you want. And with that, Michelle, Grace, and I are here to answer any questions that you have. So I'll stop sharing my screen. What questions are out there?
Hey, Steph, there was a couple questions in the chat box here. Don't know if you want to take a peek.
Great.